Okay, so Kaspar has been found by an American guest, a young girl called Elizabeth, and she's promised to keep it a secret. And Johnny Trot's pleased because Kaspar will eat for Elizabeth. So let's see what happens next. I had no idea then, and I still have no idea now, how she managed to get Kaspar to eat his liver that morning. I asked her later on, once I'd got to know her better, and she gave me one of her infuriating shrugs. Animals always do whatever I tell them to do, because they know I'd do anything for them, and that's because they know I love them, and that's why they love me. She had this way, as some children do, of making everything sound so straightforward. After that first surprise visit, Miss Elizabeth Stanton, or Lizzie-Beth, as I discovered she liked to be called, came up to my room to feed Kaspar at least twice a day without fail. Sometimes I was there, sometimes I wasn't. Whenever she'd been, I'd find a little scribbled note on my pillow. It would say something like this: "Dear Johnny Trot, I came to feed Kaspar again. I stole some smoked salmon from my breakfast. He likes it a lot, which I don't, because it smells of fish and is horrible. I made your bed too, which you didn't, and you should too. Don't worry, your secret's safe, promise. I like secrets, because it's like hiding, and I like hiding. From your friend, Lizzie-Beth." There's no doubt at all in my mind that it was the arrival of Lizzie-Beth that saved Kaspar's life. Somehow she brought joy into his life where there had only been sorrow. With her there beside him, he was eating and drinking and everything that was put in front of him. Within a week he was beginning to sharpen his claws, mostly on the curtains, but sometimes on my trousers, and when I was wearing them too. That hurt a lot. I didn't mind much though, because I was just so happy to see him getting better. His coat shone, his tail twitched, and one day he smiled up at me, and I knew for sure that Prince Kaspar Kandinsky was himself again. Lizzie-Beth had lifted his spirits, and she'd lifted mine too, but I was worried that one day she might let the cat out of the bag, so to speak. I kept reminding her that secrecy was everything. "Remember, Lizzie-Beth, you've got to keep stum," I told her one evening, tapping my nose conspiratorially. She liked that, so whenever she left my room after that, she'd tap her nose. "Stum," she'd whisper. "I've got to keep stum." Lizzie-Beth became quite a little mascot in our corridor, and quite a hero too on account of everything she'd done for Kaspar. She may have been a little bit on the talkative side, and could be quite mischievous too, but she was a bundle of fun and she made us all laugh. But I couldn't help wondering whether she might one day become too overexcited and blurt out our secret by mistake. There's a picture here of Lizzie-Beth tapping her nose, and Johnny Trot with Kaspar. Meow meow. Here he is. Meow meow. I took all the precautions I could, asking her to always check behind her before she climbed the stairs to our corridor, and I made it an absolute rule that she spoke in whispers whenever she came to see us. Those, it seemed, were the type of rules she was happy with. Lizzie-Beth liked anything, I discovered, that involved some kind of conspiracy. Lizzie-Beth liked anything, I discovered, that involved some kind of conspiracy. It was during these long whispered conversations in my room that I actually got to know a lot more about her. Actually, to begin with, they weren't conversations at all, not as such. They were more like monologues. Once Lizzie-Beth started one of her stories, there was no stopping her. "Do you know," she'd begin, and she'd go on and on and on. She'd just sit there cross-legged on the floor of my room, with Kaspar on her lap, and just talk and talk and talk. And I'd be happy to listen, because she told me of a world I'd never seen before. For over a year now, since I'd left the orphanage, I'd served people like her in the Savoy, fetched and carried for them, polished their boots, brushed their coats, opened doors for them, bowed and scraped as bellboys have to do. But until now, not one of them had actually really talked to me, unless they were snapping their fingers at me or asking me to do something. It's true that I wasn't sure sometimes whether Lizzie-Beth was talking to me or Kaspar, but it didn't matter much either way. Both of us would listen as she as entranced as the other, Kaspar gazing up at her eyes all the while, purring with pleasure, and me hanging on her every word. Once she told us about the great ship she'd come over on from America, about the icebergs she'd seen, as tall as the skyscrapers in New York, which was where she lived. How one day, when they were at sea, she'd wandered off on her own to find somewhere to hide, and found herself right down below in the engine room. There was quite a kerfuffle, she said, because everyone thought she'd fallen overboard. When at last she was found and brought back to their cabin, her mother had cried and cried and called her "my little angel." But her father had told her she was the naughtiest girl in the whole world, so she wasn't quite sure what she was. Afterwards they'd taken her to the captain of the ship, who had a great fat face and sad eyes like a walrus, she said, and they'd made her apologise for causing so much trouble to the crew, who'd been searching for her all over the ship for 2 hours before she was found, and to the captain, who'd had to stop the ship in mid-ocean and had lookouts scanning the ocean with binoculars looking for her. She had to promise faithfully in front of the captain never to go off on her own when they were on the ship. She promised with her fingers crossed behind her, so it didn't count. So one day, when it got rough, they were being tossed about in the biggest, greenest wave she'd ever seen, and everyone was sick as dogs. So she decided she'd do what one of the sailors told her to do if it ever got rough, to go down to the very bottom of the ship because it doesn't roll so much, and just lie down. The very bottom of the ship, she discovered, was full of cows and calves. So she lay down beside them in the straw, and that was where they found her, fast asleep when the storm was over. This time they were both mad with her. So she was locked in the cabin as a punishment. She shrugged. "I didn't care," she said. "Who gives a fig anyway?" Back at home in New York, her governess was always sending her up to room to make her do her writing again and again, or because her spelling wasn't good enough. She was always being sent to her room by her mother too, for running round the house when she could walk, when she should be walking, or making a noise when her father was in the study. "I don't mind," she said with a shrug and a little laugh. "I don't give a fig anyway." In the holidays, the family would say, "Oh, sorry, I've forgotten to show you the picture. Hold on. There she is, sleeping with the cows on the ship. Moo, cows, moo." In the holidays, the family would sail up the coast to Maine in their 3-masted yacht, which was called the Abe Lincoln, and they'd live in a big house on an island where there was no other house but theirs, and no one there except them, their guests and their servants. One day she decided to be a pirate, so she tied a spotted pirate scarf around her head and went off with a spade to look for buried treasure. And then they came calling for her, so she hid away in a cave and only came out when she was good and ready. She knew they'd be mad at her, but she didn't really like anyone calling for her, like I was some kind of dog, she said. So when she strolled back to the house that evening, she was sent straight up to bed without any dinner. "I didn't want any dinner anyway," she said, "so I didn't give a fig, did I?" Bit by bit through these stories and dozens of others, I pieced together something of the lives of Elizabeth and her family. I looked at them now with very different eyes whenever they walked by me on their way to breakfast. Whenever I opened the door for them or wished them good morning, Elizabeth would give me a great beaming smile whenever she saw me in the lobby, and Mr. Freddy would wink at me from the front door. "Hello, Busby. All right? Okay. Just finishing off this chapter." Elizabeth would give me a great beaming smile whenever she saw me in the lobby, and Mr. Freddy would wink at me from the front door, and sometimes he'd meow softly as he passed me by. Such moments were enough to lift my spirits all day long. Life was suddenly good and fun too. Kaspar was well again, we'd both found a new friend, and our secret was safe. Everything was fine. Or so I thought. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. Kaspar.